Welcome to this live recording of the One Decision podcast. I am Kate McCann. I'm a political editor and broadcaster. And this, of course, is Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6. The question I want to start with today, if you were still head of MI6, given where we are with China, with Iran, with Israel, with Russia, with Ukraine, who would you be picking the phone up to today? And what would you be saying to them?
Well, the first thing I think I should make clear is you wouldn't be doing it yourself.
Well, actually, that's my next question. So you've already preempted me. You can't WhatsApp.
Look, if you're going to enter a dialogue which is sensitive with a foreign country, the first thing that would happen in the UK, and it's probably the same in the United States, well, it is the same, is you're going to seek political clearance. And the person you're going to be talking to is the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary, and making sure that this is in line with government policy and that there is a purpose to the meeting and you understand clearly why it's happening and there is a message to be delivered. So, why isn't this done by a conventional diplomat? Well, it might be, but if the government is particularly sensitive about a relationship and doesn't particularly want it known that there is a discussion ongoing, it might well be a senior member of the intelligence service who is a much more deniable entity than a diplomat. So you do find yourself in some pretty odd situations. So, for example, there may well be ongoing discussions at the moment. Well, certainly I would imagine, despite the tariff dimension, I'm not going to speak specifically about Trump, I would imagine there is some channel of communication between the Chinese and the US government at a moment of crisis. I mean, things get really difficult when there is no ability to communicate between two countries when there's a crisis.
Does that happen?
Well, it does, yes. When you maybe get into a state of, well, I was going to say extreme conflict, because quite often even in a state of conflict there's still a channel of communication. So, I mean, I've, in my career, I don't want to be indiscreet, have spoken...
Please be indiscreet. It's not being recorded.
All right, no. Well, it's not being recorded. Well, I've spoken to some very, very odd people who you wouldn't expect the British government to be talking to.
Can you give us an idea of who you're talking about?
Well, you have to go back through my career and think, what parts of the world were in crisis. Well, I mean, I'll give you one specific example, because the meeting didn't actually take place. But after 9/11, there was a very keen idea that someone, but probably me, should go and talk to Mullah Omar in Afghanistan. And there were intermediaries trying to arrange to see Mullah Omar, who then was the blind sheikh, well, he was called sheikh, but basically he was sort of running the Taliban in those early days. I mean, the one meeting which is publicized, which is now books written about it, when I was head of service, I flew into Libya in an unmarked plane to meet Gadaffi to negotiate Libya's getting rid of their weapons of mass destruction. And that was an extraordinary experience, which at the time, of course, no one knew was happening, but Libya did disarm, and the sensitive part of the discussion was that they should abandon their nuclear weapons program. Now, it was not in the public domain, and no one knew, well, of course it was known by intelligence agencies that they were trying to start a nuclear program. The kit having been sold to them by the father of the Pakistani nuclear program, A.Q. Khan. So A.Q. Khan's KRL laboratories had sold all the kit for the Libyans to start refining uranium and creating HEU and then weaponizing. So, I mean, the purpose of the meeting was pretty, and I mean, that happened completely in the dark at the time, and it was a very unusual experience, to say the least.
Can I come back to the Afghanistan meeting, because that's fascinating.
But it never happened.
Well, and I would like to know why it never happened. But I suppose the bigger question is...
It was politically vetoed.
But what was the purpose? What would have been the purpose of the meeting?
Well, the purpose of the meeting would be to try... Well, I'm just trying to think at the time. I mean, the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was, the big problem post 9/11. So basically, it would have been an attempt to try, probably with the assistance of the Pakistanis. So the Pakistanis were, of course, in this strange dual place. And of course, you will remember that eventually bin Laden was found in Abbottabad, sitting, in the middle of where all the Pakistani military lived. So it gives you an idea of the closeness of the relationship. So, given opportunities like that, we were willing, if it was politically agreed at the top level, to explore those opportunities to see what they might or could deliver.
Who vetoed it?
It was politically vetoed.
From our side or from the American side?
From our side.
Do you know why?
Well, I mean, politicians take a decision on policy, not worth the risk.
Not worth the risk.
Yeah.
Let's bring it back to what's happening.
And I mean, you accept that. You're not...
Did you want to go? Were you excited?
I'd love to have gone. Well, I mean, let's face it, opportunities like that, I mean, to fly into Libya at night in an unmarked plane, to charge off into the desert, see Gaddafi in his tent somewhere down in the desert with his Amazonian bodyguards.
Did he offer you a cigarette? Did he offer you a cigarette or anything? What was it?
No, he looked... I mean, it's quite extraordinary because we weren't sure what was going to happen. I mean, we just didn't know. Being, in a warm country, we were quite lightly dressed. But by the time we got into the desert, it was later.
What were you wearing?
Well, I was wearing a suit. What do you do? you look respectable if you're representing your country. There's a certain standard. And we arrived at this Bedouin encampment in the desert. I mean, it was near Sirte, south of Sirte in Libya, if any of you know the geography of Libya. And it was bloody cold. I mean, it was freezing. And Gaddafi turns up, looking rather like Mick Jagger. With tons of curly hair, his little pillbox hat, wearing a socking great camel blanket. So he was as warm as toast, and we were sitting there shivering. So, that's the sort of situation you find yourself in sometimes.
Let's bring it back to where we would be today, because you mentioned something which I find really interesting, that these kinds of talks would still probably be happening between the US and China. And we know everything that's happened today. We know the tariff war. We know the retaliation. And we know the rhetoric is ramped up too. What kind of conversations would be happening, and to what end, between those two countries right now?
Well, basically, it would be conversations about having a conversation. I mean, it would be trying to establish whether there's a willingness on both sides to start de-escalating. I mean, it's hard to imagine when things look so fierce in the public domain, but there are very odd conversations that go on in the background. I mean, between the State of Israel and their Arab neighbours. I mean, for years. I'll tell you another amusing story.
Please.
When I used to go to Saudi Arabia, one of the Saudi princes was head of the GID, their intelligence service. And on his desk, in a frame, he had a famous letter signed by the President of the United States that mistakenly referred to him as the head of Israeli intelligence. So the letter had somehow been misprinted, you see what I mean, and not corrected. And this letter had actually been dispatched to the Saudis with the seal of the United States President. And it used to sit on his desk in a frame.
No
which
wonder
used to
he framed it.
You show to all his visitors. But all I'm saying is, look, that there are very often these channels, particularly in moments of tension. But, sometimes they deliver nothing.
You explained at the start that these conversations have to begin with the political approval and the political direction of travel. It's set by somebody else. How do you navigate in those meetings making progress with that political ambition? Because there must be, if you were going into a meeting with China at the moment as an American diplomat, what your president is saying is at odds with what you would be going to them with. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, you're not a diplomat. You're not there to conclude anything. You're really there to explore how a relationship might develop in the future, unless there's a very specific reason to it, like a hostage exchange or something like that. I mean, there might be a very, very precise objective. But if it's a general meeting trying to establish... Look, I'm sure most of you will know this from your studies, but the early negotiations, if you can call them that, in Ireland with the IRA, the provisional IRA, were conducted by a senior MI6 officer. So if you're sitting down with a terrorist movement that's still killing British soldiers, which is basically what was happening, but there was a conversation going on which eventually led to a peace process. So, I mean, that's a very clear, very well documented example, which I can talk about because there are long books written about it, and it's all pretty much in the public domain now. So there are many examples you can draw on, but you have to bear in mind that you would have very clear limits to your authority. You can't necessarily agree something. I mean, you might, if you have the specific remit to do so, you might.
Yeah.
And I mean, the remit that I had with Gaddafi was no deal unless you include all the nuclear technology. And at that moment, the meeting concluded after about 4 hours without him saying clearly whether it would be or wouldn't, because he said, well, we don't have any. To which the answer was, well, you actually do.
Well, there's not really anywhere you can go from
and then
that,
at that point, the meeting stops.
I want to just reflect a bit on China, because the UK's relationship with China is changing. I mean, I'm looking at an article in the Times today. So Tony Radakin has visited China and given a really an unprecedented talk. If you've not read this piece, it's on the times.com. If you've not read it today, it's worth a read. What do you make of the head of Britain's armed forces making that trip at this moment in time?
That's very sensible.
But it is surprising, isn't it?
Well, it is surprising. But I mean, I've been to China professionally.
But in a different moment in time, I suppose.
Well, no, it was pretty. I mean, I went to China to negotiate the intelligence aspects of the joint over Hong Kong. So the winding up of Hong Kong Special Branch, which was basically a Western run US-UK outfit in China, and it had to be, well, obviously when the Chinese, the lease expired, that all had to be, I mean, that was very sensitive and difficult negotiation. But, you know, we had to discuss that. And I mean, Tony Radakin, it's good that there is an ability to talk. I mean, Chinese Navy is building more tonnage in a year to 18 months each year than composes the whole of the Royal Navy. That's the speed of its expansion. We're a mercantile nation. China's a mercantile nation. There are points of tension to do with the cross-strait, to do with Taiwan. These things are less likely to flare into accidental crises which could lead to things more serious if there's a channel and there's a dialogue, even if you're in a state of near conflict.
Do you think the UK can trust China?
Well, they reneged on the joint declaration on Hong Kong, so the answer to that is no.
So how do you work that
You have to trust them to an extent. But the trouble is that these relationships vary over time. You might make a deal. We made a deal over Hong Kong. It lasted how long? 5, 6 years? At which point, the interesting thing about Hong Kong, I think the Chinese were terrified of the virus of democracy being injected backwards into China. Because what surprised the Chinese about Hong Kong was that the young Chinese in Hong Kong suddenly showed, even after the Chinese takeover, that they actually believed in democracy. So this was hugely problematic for the Chinese Communist Party, which is eventually their motive for closing down the joint declaration and reneging on the whole agreement. But it didn't, it lasted for a while.
There is a moment happening with China right now. Economically, we've been talking about the tariffs for the last couple of weeks. What do you think happens next in terms of the world's relationship with China? Because there is a school of thought that what America is doing is pushing other nations closer to China once again.
Yeah, look, let's go back to basics. I think that the West made a fundamental mistake when they admitted China to the WTO on the grounds that it was a normal country or would become a normal country. So the Chinese entered the WTO on terms which have been massively beneficial to them, and the system has been hugely exploited commercially by them to the detriment of Western interests, generally speaking. Now, having said that, our economies are intertwined, so this isn't a straightforward issue. But what the West's need, the US in particular, is a level playing field, not one where the United States is playing heavily uphill, which it is at the moment. So, Trump's instincts on China are not as crazy as they might appear. In the first administration, he really changed significantly US policy on China and influenced many other Western countries. Biden didn't alter that policy. He continued it. And really what we've reached now is a further stage in that conflict. The debate about how we should handle China goes back about 20 years, longer. So it's nothing new. It's just reaching a crisis point because Trump now has escalated it to an extreme.
Do you think that, you were talking about Hong Kong a bit there, do you think that there's been a decision that the West has made, or maybe even the UK has made, over the last however many years, decade, 2 decades, that has been a turning point in that relationship? Do you look back on it and think, I wish we hadn't done that, or I wish we'd done that differently?
Well, I've been a critic since I retired of the government on how they've handled our commercial relations with China. There was a turning point. You will remember that Cameron and Osborne did that huge delegation. We were going to be China's favoured partner. Were you there?
I was.
Which some of us thought was so misplaced. Not that we wouldn't have an important economic relationship with China, but to not be critical of the way that the relationship would in future be managed, I think was a big mistake. And it sort of came to a head with Huawei and 5G. Now, that had long antecedents, that problem, because BT signed its original deal way back, when I was still in the service. Now, at the time that deal was signed, there were strong objections from people like me in the intelligence community. We were totally overruled.
Did you say, you told the politicians don't do it?
No, we said don't do it.
And they ignored you because of the financial reasons?
Well, they said, you're just the intelligence officers, you're not policymakers, get stuffed. I'm putting it a bit rudely, but that's effectively what the message was. And they said, no, the commercial relationship with China is much more important. But, over time, that has been reassessed. And initially, I was retired by then. When I spoke up about 5G and Huawei, I got told by everybody to shut up. But I'm pleased to say that we eventually won the argument, thanks to the Australian government, thanks to the US government, and thanks to the sort of reassessment of the risk of putting the country's 5G into China's hands. The fact is, you cannot get around the security problem that any Chinese corporation is ultimately under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. If in a crisis they are told to jump,
they will.
They will. They have to. That's Chinese law. So there's no argument about it. So to have a system whereby stuff could be buried into
within
our 5G,
network.
it's ridiculous. And there is this now publicized case 2 years ago, we don't know whose car it was, where a Chinese electric car, which is a government car in the UK, is being eavesdropped in Beijing.
Are you concerned about that? Because the government is saying it will not put any barriers on Chinese exports of cars, electric vehicles, to this country. There is a world in which they do flood into the UK. I'm
really worried about this, and I'll tell you why. Because in every Chinese car, there is a cellular module which is connected to the Internet of Things, and that car in a crisis can be reprogrammed by the manufacturer in China. And you can find your Chinese car, 40 of them, let's say, around London immobilized. The Chinese could bring, in a crisis, UK city to a grinding halt, bang, with the flick of a switch in Beijing. No one seems to understand this. Well, they do, actually. Quite a few of us understand it. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. All I'm saying is that if there were a serious international conflict, let's say over Taiwan, and we side with, in an extreme case, American expeditionary force going to the rescue of Taiwan, we could find suddenly that we have some very, very serious problems on our infrastructure in the UK. A lot of our renewable sources of energy are Chinese manufactured, with cellular modules in them that can be reprogrammed from China. You could knock out the whole of a North Sea wind farm, bang.
Do you think people in your position right now are issuing the same warning that you did about Huawei to the current government about electric cars?
They're listening. They are definitely listening and understand the problem. I think the problem with Chinese vehicles, it's got to the point of, well, what can you do to reverse the situation now? It's going to be very difficult to change that. But people have got to be alive to the fact. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I spent my life telling people that you never believe a conspiracy theory. But there is a serious technical issue. And I'm shortly going to address a committee in the House of Commons, the Committee on Secure Technology, I think it's called, which is a cross-party committee on this very issue. I've been invited to speak in the Commons on it.
And your warning will be what we need to be aware of it and develop our own technology to prevent it? Or?
Well, maybe in due course we need to make sure that a Chinese electric vehicle is not cannot be reprogrammed by the manufacturer. I mean, basically, that's what it boils down to. Now, it's not technically that straightforward to get around the problem. We need to be aware of the problem. We need to have a plan in the medium term to do something about it. I'm not saying, we don't buy anything from China. That's ridiculous. That you've got to have a practical view, and we have a very close trading relationship with China. That's a given. No one's going to change that.
I've made it to 56 minutes past 4 without mentioning Donald Trump.
That's pretty good.
I mean, you let slip his name, I think, a couple of minutes in. But
I did.
We've done quite well. But let's talk about Donald Trump, because we've talked around the themes of trust and how you manage that relationship. How do you think people in your position right now in the British government, what are they doing? What are they thinking about Donald Trump? Will they have had any warning, for example, about his tariff changes? Will they have had anybody give them a ring beforehand to let them know? How does that work?
Well, if the embassy in Washington is doing its job.
Is that an indication you don't think it is?
No, I didn't say that. It should have had a pretty clear idea. Look, I knew through talking to personal friends that the sanctions on China were coming, and I think I knew pretty much how big they were. So it hasn't been a closely guarded secret. It's been a policy which was declared by Trump a long time ago. A lot of people thought he'd never do it, but actually Trump has a pretty good track record of doing what he says he's going to do. Well, everybody's so shocked because it's happened. And of course, it's massively disruptive. And of course, the bond market yesterday gave a verdict which was serious enough for Trump to have suspended a lot of it for 90 days. And I don't believe that was a plan. I mean, it wasn't a plan to introduce and then suspend.
Yeah.
So I think, that vibration, which was a change of direction. I mean, it's a little bit similar to what happened to our 49-day Prime Minister. The bond market gave a verdict.
And it definitely gave its verdict on Trump. He defined it as queasy, I think, overnight. He called the bond market. One of the things, though, about Donald Trump and that unpredictability, at least of his actions, you're right, he does tend to say that he's going to do something. It's whether or not he's ever going to do it. It's not just economic, it's diplomatic, security and defence too. The suspension of intelligence sharing with Ukraine, was that for you a red line crossed by America? Or was that something that has happened before and we just don't know about it?
I'm sure things like that have happened before, not quite with that degree of drama. I mean, look, the Ukrainian regime, put this in an article I wrote recently, the phrase I use is putty in American hands. Militarily, at the moment, they are heavily dependent on American support. And it can't really be replicated. What they're being given can't be replicated by any other nation. So, and it's quite clear, that the chemistry between Trump and Zelensky is terrible. They don't get on. They don't like each other. They don't get on with each other, and that's been clear for some time. But if you want, to force Zelensky to accept a ceasefire, if you switch off the intelligence for 8 days, I think it was, and during those 8 days they pretty much lost the Kursk salient. So you can see immediately the detrimental effect it had militarily on the Ukrainians.
But would it have been for the UK as a Five Eyes partner, and I'm not going to explain Five Eyes to this room because you will understand it better than I do, but as a Five Eyes partner, what would our reaction have been? I mean, you will know. I'm asking you, what would it have been? I know that you will know because I know you still speak to these people. What was the reaction?
Well, I think, the UK takes a different view on the policy issue of bringing not a different view necessarily on the policy issue of a ceasefire, but how you get Ukraine and Russia to the ceasefire table. And disagreements on policy between the United Kingdom and the United States. I mean, we aren't that significant a player in comparison to US power. We're influential for all sorts of historical reasons, but we're not a power player. So, when the US takes a decision like that, it's taken unilaterally, and you have to suck it up, basically. It's pretty disconcerting. And given the involvement, I don't want to be too specific here, of the UK military,
yeah,
it's pretty difficult because most of the US support is organized from Wiesbaden. So the technical link is to the US military in Wiesbaden, and there are no senior military officers at all in Ukraine. Now, that was a Biden decision. But you have to imply from that
that's not necessarily the case for us.
I'm not going to talk about
I know
what
you're
the
not
actual,
saying it.
I'm not saying it out loud what the case is, but
yes,
you can imply.
It means it leaves us exposed in a way that they are not exposed, which I suppose leads me to my next question, which is, in your view, is Five Eyes still workable? Is it still valuable?
I wrote an article about this 4 weeks ago, which appeared in The Spectator, which has been much read and commented on. But yes, it's still alive, it's still important, it's still valuable, it's still essential to I would go as far as saying, to the sort of safety of the Western world on a number of areas and issues. It was originally a secret treaty signed in 1947 between the United Kingdom and the United States for the sharing of intercept, essentially signals intelligence. Canada, Australia, Canada joined next, then Australia, then New Zealand. It was important during the Cold War because of the geographical distribution of its listening posts. But it evolved into much more than that, because it's also an intelligence sharing mechanism. So if you take the Joint Intelligence Committee in the UK, which sits on Wednesday afternoons, the sessions which are not UKISA are attended by Five Eyes representatives. So the JIC intelligence machine is shared 5 ways between those nations, and they choose to contribute what they contribute.
Does everyone always pull their weight?
I'm not going to answer that question. There are 1 or 2 nations that sometimes. Well, look, they're not all equal players, obviously.
No, we bring different skills to the table. Yeah.
But the key players are 3. You'll have to guess who those are.
Mm-hmm. Do I want to guess?
No, I'm just saying 3 of them give much more than 2, but it's shared at 5.
So everybody has an advantage, which is why I asked the question. I suppose, is there ever a world in which you think that, are there any other agreements that we don't know about? These kind of bilateral agreements?
There are some agreements that aren't advertised. There are intelligence agreements regionally, which maybe some of them not. I think this is probably the most significant one, but it does a lot of stuff which is, it can deal with things like the scourge of child pornography. Intercept can cover a lot of areas which you don't necessarily immediately think of. But on counterterrorism and dealing with strategic threats, it's really an important, and it's institutionalized. So it's been going since 1947, and it's based on a signed treaty. Well, yes, it is a signed treaty. So UCUSA, and the text of that treaty wasn't published until 2010. So it was secret from 1947 to 2010 when it came into the public domain. So it's not like the US and Ukraine, which is temporary.
Yeah.
You can flick a switch. it can go on, it can go off. This is institutionalized and heavily institutionalized and has an existence which has gone through many political crises. I mean, think of the relationship with the United States after the Suez invasion of 1956, am I right?
Yes.
I think 56. When the state of play politically between the UK and the US was appalling. But
yet it persists.
It didn't actually stop Five Eyes from operating.
I want to bring in some of your questions shortly, but I feel like we can't really talk about intelligence sharing without talking about the Signal Gate issue.
Yeah.
Now, we know Signal, we know what happened, we know what's been shared, we understand how it's happened. So I don't really want to talk about all of the stuff that's already been talked about. But I do want to try and understand, how do you do what we all do on our phones all the time and share that kind of information? You have access to information that we will never have. How do you go about... All right, fine. I'm talking about you as a sort of idea.
Yeah, thanks.
How do you go about it? How do they go about it?
Well, I mean, basically, if you're in government, you don't use your mobile phone.
But I know that's not true.
Well, hang on a moment. No. Well, look, politicians and mobile phones are a complete menace because they haven't got a clue about security.
Great for political journalists.
I'm not going to. I was a poacher, not a gamekeeper. All right, so I know exactly how ill-disciplined all politicians are with mobile phones. They're a gift to the intelligence community. Now, if you go into an intelligence building in the UK, you have to leave all your devices. They go into Faraday pouches, and you're not allowed to take anything in. Why? Well, for obvious reasons. So you do not communicate using, publicly available means. I mean, I use Signal now to talk to my retired friends because we like a degree.
What's the former intelligence chief WhatsApp group called, or Signal group called?
So I use Signal because Signal's actually reasonably secure, but it's not completely secure. American politicians taking sensitive policy decisions absolutely shouldn't be using Signal. I mean, it's completely out. Thank God they were caught, because it means that they would have stopped. They've all got devices provided by NSA which are non-interceptable, but they're inconvenient, a little bit clunky, and politicians want something immediately. I used to travel a lot with Blair. The moment the plane landed, they've all got their blinking mobile phones out. They're all talking, around.
What's the worst?
You don't do that.
What's the worst?
I mean, if you go to China,
case?
Don't take a mobile phone that you habitually use. Do not take a PC. Don't. Because the Chinese will download the whole lot.
I have to tell you something. I'm going to confess it to you and the room. When I went to Russia.
Just as a matter of, whoever you are, it'll be downloaded and stuck in a database, and it's there forever.
I went to Russia with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary. And before we went on that trip, we were hauled in for a briefing at the Foreign Office, and they said all of the obvious things. Don't take your phone with you. Don't take your laptop with you. Don't take your Kindle with you. Also, if someone tries to chat you up in a bar, they don't fancy you. It's not that. Just genuinely, be a bit sensible. And we were all very sensible about it, and I took it very seriously. And I didn't take a phone, none of us did. Went to the hotel on the first day, and I thought myself a bit James Bond. So I unplugged the phone, and I unplugged the TV, and I looked under the bed to see if there were any cameras and all of that, and I felt I'd done a really good job. And it had been a very long flight, and I thought, right, before we have dinner, I'm going to just get in the shower. So I took all my clothes off, turned around, and I'd left the door of the hotel room open. So I needn't have worried about any compromat cameras or anything like that, because my bomb was on display to anyone who walked past at that point. So you must have had a You must have had a slip up in your time. Maybe not your bum, but...
Well, I lived behind the Iron Curtain for a significant period of time. That was in Czechoslovakia. But, I think the builders happened to redo the house we lived in after I had left. And I think they took 17 microphones out of my house.
17 microphones?
Yeah. They were in the bedroom, the bathroom, the living room, everywhere. Kitchen, everywhere. The whole house was completely bugged.
Did you know who was responsible?
Of course.
Enlighten us.
Well, it was the STB. I mean, it was the Czech services. The Czechoslovak services.
Were you living knowing that, though?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so you just assumed that the whole time?
I just assumed it. But what I'm saying is that it was... people just don't sort of understand what it's like to live in an autocracy that is targeting you. Okay, I was a Czech-speaking British diplomat, probably an intelligence officer, they weren't quite sure. Well, they knew by the time I had left. And, that's what it was like. And, when I lived there, my wife and I, both together or separately, on average were followed 15, 20 days a month, usually by 4 to 5 vehicles, with 3 or 4 people in each vehicle, so that when we went on foot, we were then followed by these big teams. It was just life. That's how it was. They wanted it to be clandestine, but of course it wasn't particularly. I was trained in counter-surveillance. I knew.
Did you feel, I'm going to bring questions in after this, but did you feel like you could live as the real version of yourself?
Yeah, I think you just have to get on with life and not... I was there for a very specific reason. And actually, a wonderful lady here at King's London, Daniela Richterova, who some of you may or may not know, is about to write a book about the big espionage case that I ran in Czechoslovakia, because it's in the public domain in Czechoslovakia, not in the UK. So she's got all the Czech archives, and she's about to write a very significant book about it. But no, you just have to lead, as far as possible, a normal life and get on with it.
Thank you so much to King's and to the War Studies Society for hosting us here today for this live edition of the One Decision podcast. With me, Kate McCann, and Sir Richard Dearlove. We've loved chatting with you today, and I hope that you've had some interesting insights from, I would say, one of the men with the most insights going in the political and defence and spy world. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.